to mundo fine, night train to the end. Running hard and running fast to meet my future and away from my past. Taking the gamble that cannot last. Night train to the end.
Hello, this is the Frater Night Show, and the article we're going to talk about is the device that tried to predict the weather with leeches. The parasitic creatures that could have been the key to Victorian era meteorology, and the guy that had the weird idea. A version of this post originally appeared on Tedium, a twice weekly newsletter that hunts for the end of the long trail. If you're like me and one of the few remaining artifacts of the pre-internet age that you're able to regularly revel in is the mail order catalog. I particularly love dust toys highlighted that show off often some of the most luxurious are vintage weather prediction devices. There's a long history of vintage weather prediction devices. After all, for example, the first known barometer dates to 1641, a device developed by Galileo and fellow polymath Evangelista Torricelli. Ever since measures of air pressure have been used in weather prediction, when pressure is decreasing, stormy conditions tend to be on the way. But one oddball weather machine stands out above the rest, the Victorian Tempest Prognosticator, a vintage weather forecast device you're most likely to see on a desk toy anytime soon. Not likely. Mostly maintaining one also means taking care of a dozen leeches. Here's how it came into existence. The physician who thought leeches could be the perfect tool for predicting the weather. George Merriweather, a member of the Whitby, North Yorkshire's then thriving intellectual scene, masterminded the Tempest Prognosticator as a years-long hobby that culminated in its public display in 1851. As a physician, Merriweather would already have been quite familiar with the leeches, but in his essays, Merriweather said he was inspired by a poem which spoke of how the common medicinal leech tends to move up in a jar of rainwater as a storm nears, then settle to the bottom in clear conditions. To harness this instinct, Merriweather placed 12 leeches in their own jars of rainwater, ranged in a circle to keep each other company. Atop of each jar, he rigged a piece of whalebone in a chain that, when yanked, would hit a bell he had placed in the center. As leeches rose to the top of their jars in advance of a storm, they would come into contact with the bone and sound the bell. The more bells it sounded, the more likely there was to be a storm, and the more tense it was likely to be, as it would have been preposterous to have a bell for each leech. I made use of simple contrivance. By placing a bell around a pedestal erected on the center of the circular platform, which bell was surrounded by 12 hammers. From each of these hammers was suspended a gilt chain, each of which played upon a pulley, which was placed in a disc and was a little elevated above the circle of bottles. By this method, each leech would have communication with the bell. At the time, consensus among the leech invested appears to have merged that these behaviors were due to creatures' innate ability to sense electromagnetic energy gathering in advance of a storm. Merriweather himself was a major proponent of this belief, dedicating a significant portion of his essays to reiterating Michael Faraday's contemporary work on magnetism. Unfortunately for him, we now know that this acknowledgement was likely both unnecessary and uncalled for. Leech's faculties for weather prediction turns out to actually be pretty patchy, and their instincts for this area for this are far simpler than it seemed to him at the time. Leeches breathe through their body walls by absorbing the dissolved oxygen in the water they inhabit. When atmospheric pressure drops, a fractional amount less oxygen remains dissolved, and the move towards the surface where the water is more oxygen rich. In effect, the tempest prognosticator was one of the world's most elaborate barometers. What is the reason for the extraordinary multiplication of the human species during the present century? What is the cause of the super... okay, I don't know what that's about. George Merriweather, in his essays about the tempest prognosticator, within this time, the smallpox vaccine would transform medicinal science and save millions of lives in the process. What did Merriweather see in leeches anyway? Merriweather's inspiration resonates a surprising amount with our present day challenges. Thanks to our work in medicine, we knew firsthand for how damaging contagious diseases had been for previous generations. For hundreds of years, smallpox in its various forms had periodically ravaged communities or even countries with sudden resurgences, highly unpleasant and perhaps well outside the scope of what you might consider tedious at all. The smallpox was brutally efficient in its destructive effects, killing about 30% of those who were infected, and leaving many who remained alive with present complications, from skin lesions across the body to blindness. As far as about 350 years before Merriweather's birth, records of medical practice in China suggest that physicians were practicing rudimentary inoculation techniques, but Europe's saving grace came in Merriweather's own lifetime when Edward Jenner proposed and proliferated the first iteration of what closely resembles the modern smallpox vaccine. By his death in 1820s, Jenner had become one of the most important figures of his age. His work became so central to the conception of public health that 2 short years after Merriweather presented the tempest prognosticator in public, the UK would institute a smallpox vaccine mandate, leading to the era's very own anti-vaccine movement. Jenner was a personal hero to many physicians of the area, and Merriweather was no exception. The Leech poem he was inspired by came from Jenner's personal notes in his essays. Merriweather makes clear that he sees the tempest prognosticator as a tribute to Jenner's own work on vaccines, in addition to his own meteorological powers of the leech. Tempest prognosticators, the wrong solution to the right problem. Though colorful accounts of Merriweather's ambitions are occasionally spread as trivia in academic or fun fact circles, very few amount to more than dubious synthesis from modern sources. For example, while Merriweather may have documented entreaties to the British government suggesting his work be officially employed at sea, very little historic evidence seems to exist that would suggest that he was ever taken seriously. Take a break here. Okay. For example, Merriweather may have documented entreaties to the British government suggesting his work be officially employed at sea. Very little historic evidence seems to exist that would suggest he was ever taken seriously. But even if he had managed to attract the attention of decision makers, his work would have very quickly faced stiff competition. The 1840s and 1850s marked a period of explosive growth for all sorts of barometers, as industrial manufacture made the devices possible to create a previously impossible scale. None of these rivals forced the owner to care for new invalid pets. In addition, Admiral Robert Fitzroy, who had risen to public prominence for his role as captain of the HMS Beagle during the voyage which inspired Charles Darwin's work on evolution, had his own pet devices, Among them, the storm glass, a glass vial filled with chemicals that arrange themselves into crystal configurations, seemingly as random, like Meriwether Fitzroy thought his storm glass was drawn on electromagnetic signals to manifest weather predictions. But within years of his endorsement, naysayers emerged to observe that what that is mostly seemed to respond to changes in temperature. Meriwether had not anticipated these developments. In hopes of hitting it big, he designed several different variations on his apparatus, ranging from small devices that would handle only a few leeches to his own personal model, the one that would eventually be publicly showcased at Prince Albert's Great Exhibition in 1851. It was a design so grandiose and ornate, he claimed it was modeled after the architectural feats of 17th century India. Meriwether seemed to envision some level of commercial production for his devices too. He told press during the exhibition that he intended to confine this work to his hometown of Whitby, intending to build a new cottage industry of prognosticator artisans. Perhaps the most ambitious element of Mayweather's plans was a plan to distribute signals from a centralized machine. In his essays, he points out that a bell could easily be swapped for electrical contacts and the signal broadcast over wire. I could cause a little leech, covered by its instinct to ring St. Paul's Great Bell in London as a signal for an approaching storm, he asserted. If this was ever implemented, the Tempest prognosticator may have become one of the earliest examples of a network sensor array. Alas, like many of Mayweather's hopes for his apparatus, no variation of this appears to have ever come to pass. There are no known additional machines that Meriwether himself produced or oversaw production of, and all that remains today are replicas of his original machine from the exhibition. There's one at the Whitby Museum, which Meriwether himself once served as a curator of, and one of Barometer World, which is exactly what it sounds like in Devon. And that is all for today. Thank you and have a great day.